Welcome to the Emblazers show, the show for B2B Leaders Igniting Revenue. I'm your host, Amanda, and I'm joined by Tim Reister, who some might call Obi-Wan Kenobi of sales enablement. Tim, it's so good to see you.
I prefer Mr. Miyagi. I'm a more, that's more my stature, but hey.
You give more of that vibe. And
I do.
And if I'm being honest with you, I've watched Star Wars once, but Obi-Wan, he was the master, right?
Yeah. He's a mentor. He's wise. He's a sage. And I'll accept all those. So
just like
awesome.
you.
But not as smart as our guest today.
No, and gosh, I am so excited for Saad Saad to be on today. And yes, that's his name, Saad Saad. So it's very easy to remember. And
cool too.
I will say I was pretty tense at the beginning of the conversation, and I am no longer.
Well, wow, that's a cliffhanger right there. But we're going to talk about negotiations, and you would think that everything about negotiations has been talked about, but Saad has a new book and has some fresh, modern principles that include a discussion about how to manage tension, and it truly a delight. And negotiations is life. So wherever you are coming from today, this is for you.
Yes, come take a listen and you will not be disappointed. Today, we are joined by Saad Saad. Saad is a negotiation consultant, author, and educator who helps sales professionals close deals faster, secure better margins, and win more business using science-backed strategies. He's also the author of In the Lead, a practical guide to mastering sales negotiations, and he has taught at multiple universities on negotiation courses, including Columbia University, the City University of New York, and Pace University. Through his workshops and tailored coaching, Saad empowers sales teams to achieve measurable results. So excited to have him on the Emblazers show today. Saad, it is so great to see you.
Amanda, thank you for such a warm introduction. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, can't wait to learn more. And gosh, you sound like a very, very, very busy guy.
I am and happy to be. I'll take all the work.
Oh, and hey, Tim, good to see you.
Yeah, I'm just biding my time over here. Waiting to be acknowledged. Saad, so good to see you again. Saad and I go back a little ways, so this is kind of fun to have him on the show. And I'm excited for all that's going to be said and all our audience is going to hear today.
Thank you, Tim. Nice seeing you again.
So with that, here's where I want to start, Saad. You wrote a book, and it's a recent book. Amanda neglected to say it's pretty brand new, and which I think is interesting because I'm an old guy, and there's a long history of negotiations, books and research and things like that out there that in some ways it feels like negotiations training and understanding has been around for a long time. You wrote a new book. I'd love to hear from you. Like what fresh, original, exclusive insights are in that book that modern day folks need to think about when it comes to negotiations?
Absolutely, Tim. Let's start there. That's a good place to start. Tim, what really prompted me to write this book is recently this topic has sort of come back onto the front stage, especially after all these books that have come out about hostage negotiations and Chris Voss's book about Never Split the Difference. And that really prompted me to start thinking about sales negotiations, the industry in which we work in. And context really matters. What's happened in the last couple of years is that's sort of gotten lost. And it's sort of assumed that regardless of what context in which you're operating in, the negotiation strategy, approach, behaviors that you take on is the same. But a sales negotiation is different from every other kind of negotiation. A sales negotiation is entirely nested within the sales conversation. And in reality, if the sales conversation doesn't go good, the negotiation doesn't really go anywhere. You can't really get them to introduce their colleagues to you. Can't really get them to share information with you. Can't really get them to make any kind of commitments. So what I wanted to write the book about was fundamentally negotiation, but more specifically about sales negotiation, to make sure that this context is accounted for and to make sure ultimately that when we talk about this concept of negotiation, that we're doing it in such a way that's nuanced and tailored to the environment of buying and selling, not just any kind of environment.
Yeah, when you talk about hostage negotiations, and you apply that to a business to business decision. Is like, who's the hostage in this, and is that really any way to think about the transaction that should be B2B sales? So I think it's interesting because instantly I always think of negotiations as something you do at the end of a sales cycle, and it's like the Hail Mary you throw that you try to salvage a couple basis points in the deal. What I just heard you say is it's really part of the sales conversation, not the last minute save that sometimes I think we think it is. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, let's define it perhaps, Tim. There's this tendency for people when they think about negotiation, they tend to think bargaining or haggling over price. So in the context of selling, people tend to think, well, negotiating doesn't really come up until procurement gets involved all the way at the 70 or 80% mark, or when client really starts pushing back on price. And I think about, and we at Corporate Visions think about negotiation entirely in an entirely different way. The negotiation starts immediately when you first meet the client. And in reality, if you're not negotiating in those initial conversations, you're missing out on the opportunity to start to condition the client about what kind of engagement it's going to be. When I define negotiation, I simply think about it as an outcome-based conversation. Anytime you and the client are in an outcome-based conversation, regardless of the outcome that you are trying to achieve, you should be negotiating. If you're not negotiating, it's not likely, obviously, that you're going to get what you want.
So should we call it negotiations, or do we need to rename it to outcome-based conversations? Because negotiation does have sort of I don't know, like a little stink on it. But it also feels like it's just fraught with tension, and we all assume tension is super bad, and you gotta figure out how to avoid tension. And so I know you have a big, strong, sort of bold opinion on tension. But so are we saying that tension and outcomes-based conversations and negotiations are always on? And does that, I don't know, sounds stressful?
Yeah.
I'm glad you said that, Tim, because as Saad was explaining that, I'm like getting this knot in my stomach. Like, how do I get off this podcast? I don't want to hear it anymore. Saad.
I feel like every conversation with Saad is going to be like, I'm going to lose.
It doesn't have to be that at all, right? So let me just give you a little bit of personal context. I grew up in a household with 7 older siblings. My style naturally is to be conflict avoidant because that's the style that worked in our household in order to make sure the ship stayed afloat, right? So when you bring up this concept of tension, I think tension is a critical component of every conversation. Now, what do we mean by tension? Obviously, you don't want it to get into the hostile, adversarial, combative situation. That's not really tension. That's being aggressive, and that doesn't really get you anywhere with a client in which you're trying to do repeat business with. What we simply mean by tension is making sure that you condition the other person that you're negotiating with that this is a two-way street, that this has to be a give exchange, that this ultimately has to be fair and reasonable for the both of us. That's what healthy tension to me means.
So tension is just the natural feeling of a good two-way street conversation. That what we call tension and think of tension is actually just potentially being a jerk.
Yeah. Right. Being a jerk, not going to take you anywhere.
Right. Yeah.
Tension. There's some good back and forth happening.
Healthy amount of tension. So what is healthy? How does healthy tension work? And how does someone actively use it as their friend, let's just call it, as opposed to try to avoid it?
Sure. So the immediate thing that comes to me, to my mind, Tim, is this research on creativity. And the research on creativity is trying to deduce ultimately in team settings or in interactions and engagements with another person, when are people able to come up with something innovative by the end of the conversation? And the research is pretty clear on this. The environment, the engagement has to be demanding and challenging, but not threatening. Threatening, it's getting too far. You're not likely to get much done. Has to be demanding and challenging, because if it's demanding and challenging, then you're giving the incentive system for you and the other person to start thinking outside of the box. If there's no tension, it's not demanding and challenging enough. What's likely to happen in the context of the negotiation, people are likely to settle too quickly. And as a result, they end up agreeing on something that's suboptimal, not necessarily the most optimal outcome they could have reached. I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. And I'm picturing, so demanding and challenging, like, again, strong words. But I like the idea where creativity is going. Is like, if you're really in a creative environment, there's always like a back and forth that gets to a better end point, like co-created, than if it's too one-sided. So I like this. I like the word creativity to sum that up. How do you make the customer feel like that's what we're going through? We're going through a creative exercise as opposed to some sort of zero-sum game.
Yeah, absolutely. Making your intentions clear can sometimes be helpful. I'm really trying to understand what it is that you're trying to achieve. And ultimately, I have to make sure that I do something that makes sense for me. That kind of language I heard people use, that tends to work. Let's get back to how you actually induce tension into this conversation. When we say, how do you induce tension in a healthy way? It's simply by figuring out what it is that you want, the most ambitious and reasonable thing that you are trying to achieve in that situation, making sure that you convey that to the other person, and making sure that you convey it with conviction and confidence so the other person takes it seriously. You're not obviously telling them take it or leave it, but stating your case and making your case in a way that's persuasive, that's how you start to induce tension into these conversations, healthy tension.
So I like that, Saad. You said that, I wrote it down, like you have to introduce the tension, and you do that by expressing like your ultimate goal in the negotiation from your perspective, right? As the seller, sounds like a concept, we've heard in science, behavioral science, called anchoring. You want to anchor somebody in a good place for you and work from there. But yeah, expressing your top end would create some tension. Any other tips, tricks, or concepts around tension that I and the listeners could take away and even start practicing tomorrow?
Yeah. So the research on this concept of anchoring is that pretty much people make decisions based on reference points. They tend to hang on too much to the initial sort of proposition and then make decisions based on that, subsequent decisions based on that. So the first tip is obviously introduce what it is that you're trying to achieve, convey that, support that. Before you ultimately shift to really engaging with the other side very meaningfully, you need to make sure that after you convey what it is that you're trying to achieve, you need to support that and sit in the tension for a little bit. What do I mean by that is, yes, you need to make yourself clear, but the other side needs to take you seriously. They need to know that you're being thoughtful here, that you can support what it is that you're asking for. That's typically the flow that we suggest. At some point on the other side, obviously, you don't want it to get hostile and adversarial. So the model that we use here is make yourself clear, support what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then empathize with the other side and actively listen. That includes asking questions, that includes paraphrasing. From there, you shift to brainstorm. That's in essence throwing out some things that would work for you, that would work for them. After you've made yourself clear, they've made themselves clear. And then ultimately you make a trade. That's the model that we use very in a simplified way, but you use that across every tangible thing that you have to negotiate. You rinse and repeat across the entire sales cycle, whether you're negotiating access to stakeholders or whether you're negotiating agreement on deal terms.
So much in there. I want to come back to the making trades thing, so don't let me forget that. But back in the day when I'd ride in an airplane and I'd see a negotiations class advertised in the magazine, do you remember that?
Yeah.
And I think it used to say, the one who speaks first loses.
Yep.
And I think I just heard you say the opposite. It sounds like you should speak first to set that higher
Absolutely.
anchor. Is that right?
Yeah, almost all the empirical evidence suggests that ultimately in negotiations, in most situations, especially in the sales context, that you should make yourself clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve. This concept of anchoring, people tend to define as strictly numbers, but it's not just numbers. As you and I can be negotiating something that's not number related, and I can tell you what direction I want to go in, that becomes the anchor. You want to make sure that you are the first one that puts that on the table and anchors on that to make sure that the other person is ultimately making the decision off of what it is that you want to achieve.
So you heard it here, folks. If you're still subscribing to the idea of the one who speaks first loses, you're following bad advice, and it's not. The data supports the exact opposite.
Yep.
So this issue of trades, that too. Like, I think sometimes what happens, it feels like, is the customer keeps asking, and then you keep giving, and you hope it's going to stop. So talk to me about trades, because that feels like a technique that one really should get a hold of.
Absolutely. And that's the tendency for people that I see all the time. Tim, Amanda, I see this happening, is rather than starting at making demands, what people tend to do in their negotiations, especially salespeople who want to come off customer centric and who want to come off reasonable, they tend to start at trades. So rather than me telling you, here's what I need from you, they say something along the lines of, I can give you this kind of discount if you do a 2-year. And it seems like a reasonable thing to do, but what tends to happen in these situations is it tends to leave the other side with the impression that there's room for negotiation. And maybe I anticipated that there was this much room, but because you're going to trades repeatedly, you're leaving me with the impression that I should continue to test your resolve because I may be able to extract even additional value from this. So start with the demand, support it, justify it, hold the line a little bit. You're going to go to trades at some point, but if you start at trades, you're not sitting in the tension long enough. It's likely that you're doing too much conceding and accommodating by the end.
So don't speak first and then hold your peace. And then when you think you want to speak again, hold a little longer.
Yeah. And the research supports that exact thing, Tim, is that people have a better appreciation for things that are earned. When concessions and trades feel like they're too easy and you just kind of gave them to me, they don't really feel like concessions. They feel like you put in too much baloney in your initial offer and you already accounted for this. And I probably need to test your resolve a little bit more.
And a lot of this feels like, and earlier we talked about this, that it does feel a little bit like that end game negotiation. But I've heard you say this before, and you said it earlier, that negotiations is really happening all throughout the sales conversation, from the first conversation. I think I've heard you say every conversation is a negotiation.
Yep.
I get that, because I raised 4 kids, and I felt like every conversation was a negotiation. Now that they're out of the house, I don't know. I'm less tension.
You're out of practice. You're out of practice.
I am out of practice too, that's for sure. But I don't know. Seems a little more peaceful.
Yeah.
So they don't watch, so it doesn't matter. So I guess every conversation is a negotiation. Talk to us about that and how we can process that so that it feels natural.
Yeah, absolutely. So the key theme here is in negotiations, especially in sales negotiations, you need to be deliberate, intentional. You need to be proactive. You can't be reactive. When you go into these conversations, not knowing what you really want or not having the intent to structure those conversations as negotiations, you're not going to get what you want. So go into it with the mentality that I have to be proactive. Now, before you start the conversation, what are some of the things that you need to do to make sure that you structure it as a negotiation? One, you need to figure out, what are you really trying to achieve at this particular point? Obviously, in the beginning of a sales cycle, you can't really ask the client to sign. Maybe something as simple as, I need them to give me access to this data, or I need them to introduce me to this particular person. You need to be crystal clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve at that particular point. Be ready to support it. Be ready to justify it. Be ready to stay curious and hear out the other side and make them obviously genuinely feel like they're part of this conversation. And then before you go into this conversation, you also need to identify, if this person says no to this ask, what are some things I can give them in return? What are some things that I can trade with that allows them to say, you know what, sure, I'll do the thing that you want me to do, because in return, here's what I'm going to get. And if you structure that entire process from the beginning, all the way from hello, all the way to PO, and these sort of mini negotiations all along the path, what you tend to do is you tend to get across the sales cycle much faster, because you're clear on what you want and you're being deliberate and intentional every step of the way. And when you get to the margin conversation, you tend to do better, because you've obviously left the client with the impression that this has to be a two-way street. They're not left with the impression that you're going to be the one doing all the giving at the end of the day.
Saad, you just wrote the name of your second book, Hello to PO.
From hello to PO. So that you have to have a memorable catchphrase anymore these days. So we'll hashtag that for you. And see, that sounded like an old guy saying right there.
Tim, don't worry. I wrote a note to go back to whichever this magazine is that you used to read back in the day on Braniff Airlines or wherever you got this Sky Mall from.
Right. Acme Air, right? It was right, exactly. And I can't remember the guy's name, but I don't want to say it because it might sound like I'm bashing somebody. But I clearly the days before Wi-Fi and an airplane, you actually looked at those magazines.
Yeah.
Dynamic revenue growth leaders know that Emblaze is the leadership insights community for them.
As the world of sales is constantly evolving and constantly changing, I think it's even more critical to get together with people to understand how are they helping to solve some of the problems that our buyers have today.
We always find a lot of value in the partnerships that we're able to form with some of the other great organizations that are part of the team here. And personally, I love the opportunity to connect with my peer group outside of other organizations and learn from them and try to figure out if there's things that they're doing that we can pull into our organization and benefit from.
Go to emblazegrowth.com/join and start your free Insights membership. Take control of your revenue future today.
So Saad, sometimes I feel like when I hear about, I'm going to go now to the procurement end again a little bit, or at least the discussion around asking for discounting or asking for concessions. It's going to happen. We need to know it's going to happen because that's the win that the buyer needs to feel like they got. So I have a question for you. Is there a better or worse way to do it, knowing you're going to have to do it? Like medicine, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. What makes a discount request go down better?
Sure. Yeah. Generally, there's three suggestions on concessions, all based on empirical evidence. They are: don't give it all away at once. If you have to give away concessions, give them away incrementally. So let's say you have a 10% discount you can give. Don't give away all the 10 at once. People, again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, have a better appreciation for things that are earned. If it feels too easy, it's not defined as a concession. Incremental is the first one. The second one, decreasing, meaning you should be conscious of the value of concessions you're giving to the other side. And ideally, the value of those concessions as the conversations go should decrease. The impression that you want to leave them with is that we're getting towards the finish line. So the typical recommendation that I make is the biggest concession in the beginning of the conversation. When I say beginning, that doesn't mean first conversation. that I mean at some point in the sales process when you're ready to give some kind of concession, the biggest one there. And then as you get closer and closer to the finish line, your concessions should be decreasing in value and to leave the impression that that's it, there's nothing more. The best research that I've seen that supports both of those 2 points, incremental and decreasing, is that you tend to get less ambitious counter offers from the other side. And what that tells us is the other side is starting to adjust their expectations from their expectations closer to your anchors, your numbers, and your expectations. So those are two empirically supported tips. The last one I would add is any concession you give, especially in complex B2B sales processes, should be labeled. What do I mean by that? You may start negotiating with a procurement person and they have no idea where you started or that you've already conceded to a business buyer. Anytime anybody starts asking you for a discount, the best place for you to start is, here's how we started. Here's what we initially proposed. Here's why that's fair, reasonable, merited, and label any concession that you've engaged in or given in the past to make sure that they're left with the impression that I'm trying to work with you. What the research tells us is that tends to elicit reciprocity. They tend to feel like, okay, you're trying to work with me. Now I need to reciprocate. I need to return the favor.
So interesting. So if I had 10% to give, the biggest number, and then gradually smaller numbers so they know it's ending, how would you divide my 10%? How would you put it into that? I don't know. It feels like some sort of a descending, shrinking number. So
sure. So if I had to play around with it, Amanda, I don't know if you had something here.
Well, and also maybe just to add to that question is like, and how many times do you sort of go back and forth with the customer before it gets just like, let's just get to the end of it already?
10, 9, 8, 7, 6. Yeah. No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It's not a countdown.
So how many rounds adjust to the context in which you're working in? We used to work with a telecommunications company, and sellers had to deal with up to 25 people on the other side that had to sign off. In those situations, they really planned for multiple rounds. Minimum, you plan for 2 to 3 rounds. In most situations, that tends to be what's reasonable, but you should always have something in your back pocket. So if we're working with this 10, a typical recommendation, if I'm just sort of spitballing here, is maybe you start with a 6% discount in exchange for a 2-year deal rather than a 1-year deal. And then you go to a 3% discount and then a 1% discount. Obviously, with that 3 and 1, you want to ask for something in return as well to make sure that the other person is left with the impression that, hey, I'm engaging and giving you something of value. You also need to return the favor as well.
So the trade it shows up here again.
Exactly.
So incremental, I saw it in your numbers. Decreasing, saw it in your numbers. I'm sure you would have labeled that. But every time you negotiated for something in return, is that something people tend to forget?
Absolutely. Any organization that I've worked with that has a client-centered culture tends to be all about the client. How can we get this deal over the finish line? And the tendency is they tend to be the ones doing all the giving. The other person is not really giving anything meaningful in return. The impression that tends to leave is you're devaluing the thing that we're negotiating because you're not inducing enough tension into this conversation. And the unintended consequence of this is sometimes that actually prolongs the negotiation because the other side is never left with the impression that the negotiation is ended. That every time I ask, there could be more. So let me just go back and ask and ask and ask again.
There's a lot of psychology here. And in that and everything we've talked about, and in a world where everybody's talking about, well, is our sellers going to be replaced by AI? Saad, I have to bring up AI in every episode, otherwise
It really does.
I got to get a ticket. They're like, oh no, the AI police coming. We need our pound of flesh. Punch my ticket. But in all seriousness, a lot of this feels yet like a thing that is still distinctly human. What's going on between the two parties feels like AI can do a lot of things for now and maybe in the foreseeable future. This seems like an area of skill development and mastery that the teams and the people listening, that's going to be your domain yet. The humans remaining value add. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree 100%. At the end of the day, this is a human-human conversation. There's certain skills that you need to apply in this conversation. This is not to say there isn't a place for AI altogether. I think AI can be perhaps very useful in preparing for these conversations, anticipating some objections you might get, clarifying what the demand you're going to make, how it might sound to the other side, thinking through that framework that we talked about a little bit earlier and getting yourself ready for that conversation. AI may be a very useful tool, but I think at the end of the day, this is really a conversation that has to be had human to human. And ideally in this world, I'll add this is important because there's research that supports this. Do this human to human. What I mean by that is if you can meet them in person, fantastic. If you're on Zoom, turn on your camera. Don't try negotiating over email because it never goes well. And research tends to suggest that those types of situations tend to land in the greatest number of impasses. So the more you can get in front of them and have this human to human interaction, the more flexibility you'll tend to see, the more creativity you tend to see, because at the end of the day, it's two people interacting and engaging with each other. I went a little bit off track there, but I hope that answers your question too.
Well, yeah, I mean, it does. And it continued in the vein of like humanity. But it still supports the idea of tension, like meet with them or show your face. And the reality is it will ease that, even though you feel like it's going to add tension. Yeah, we've gotten too quick to say, can I just get this all done by email? And you're saying it doesn't end well for anybody. So.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that the things people will say online, they don't really say face to face. People tend to be a lot more collaborative and a lot more forgiving, and you tend to be able to manage this concept of tension in a lot more of a healthy way when you see the other person rather than when it's sort of just disattached altogether.
Saad, that was just so incredible. And I feel a lot less tense than I did earlier in the podcast. So thank you for breaking all of this down for me and for Tim. Just have a ton of notes here, and I'm sure our listeners do too. Just some really incredible insights that you had to share with us.
And what's the name of that book again, Saad? What is that before we let you go?
Thank you, Tim. In the Lead.
In the Lead.
Yes.
All right. The modern day negotiation book, the freshest piece of negotiation work since the airplane magazines.
And on that note, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Emblazers show. Make sure that you like and subscribe and continue to listen. We've got some great guests on the show coming up. Thanks for tuning in.